The wind came down from the mountains like a wounded beast that night, howling through the cottonwoods and scattering dust across the open range. Rain followed close behind, sweeping in gray sheets that blurred the line between earth and sky. Inside his cabin, Cole Maddox, a cowboy who'd spent too many years watching storms from behind cold windows, sat near the dying fire with a half-empty cup of coffee and a silence that had grown too loud. He wasn't expecting company. Not this late, not in weather like that. Yet when the thunder cracked so close it rattled the lamp glass, he heard another sound beneath it, a sharp, desperate knock. For a moment he thought it was the wind playing tricks, but then it came again. Softer, uncertain, like someone afraid of both being heard and being ignored. Cole rose slowly, every step echoing against the floorboards that had long since forgotten laughter or footsteps not his own. When he opened the door, the storm spilled in around a woman cloaked in wet wool and trembling light. Her name was Ilara Quinn, and she looked like every heartbreak he'd tried to forget. Her hair, drenched and clinging to her face, shone dark as midnight. Her eyes, those wide, glassy eyes, were full of something deeper than fear. "The bridge washed out," she said through chattering teeth. "My horse panicked, and I couldn't make it back to town." Cole didn't ask for more. The storm outside was cruel enough without dragging questions through it. He just stepped aside and let her in. The cabin seemed to shrink when she crossed the threshold, her presence filling every quiet inch that loneliness had claimed. She stood by the fire, arms folded around herself, and the heat of the room began to thaw her shivers. Her dress clung to her like a confession she hadn't meant to speak aloud. And Cole, God help him, felt something he hadn't let himself feel in years. The silence between them was a living thing. The fire crackled the roof side, and still neither spoke. She looked around as though the walls themselves carried stories she shouldn't hear. "You live out here alone?" she asked finally, voice low, almost lost beneath the thunder. Cole nodded. "Got used to it," he said. "Don't much take to people these days." She smiled faintly, though her lips were pale. "Guess that makes two of us." There was no wedding ring on her hand. He noticed, but didn't comment. Out here everyone had ghosts. Some wore them like jewelry. Others buried them deep and prayed the rain would keep the soil from giving them back. He offered her a blanket, rough wool, but warm, and poured her a cup of coffee from the pot by the hearth. She thanked him, her fingers brushing his when she took it. It wasn't much, a second of touch, a flicker of warmth, but it struck through him like lightning. He turned away, busying himself with the fire. "You can stay till morning," he said. "Storm'll ease up by then." She hesitated, eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "You don't have to be kind," she whispered. "Not to me." The words hit harder than the rain on the roof. Cole looked at her then, really looked. There was sorrow in her face that no weather could have carved. Something older, something human. "Maybe I ain't kind," he said quietly. "Maybe I just know what it's like to have no place to go when the night comes down." Outside, thunder rolled across the plains like a warning. But inside that little cabin, the air changed. Something in the storm began to mirror them, wild, unspoken, trembling on the edge of breaking. She set her cup down slowly, staring into the fire as if afraid of what might stare back. "I shouldn't have come," she said softly. "But I couldn't stay out there, not tonight." Cole's voice was steady, though his pulse wasn't. "You did right. Ain't no one should face a storm alone." When she turned to him, eyes bright with tears she didn't shed, the words she spoke next were barely more than a breath. "I don't want to be alone tonight." For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. The rain, the wind, even the crackle of the fire. Cole stood in that silence like a man caught between mercy and madness. He stepped forward slowly until only the firelight stood between them. Then, without a word, he reached for the door, pushed it shut, and turned the lock against the storm. The rain outside grew heavier, hammering against the roof like 1,000 galloping hooves, as if the whole prairie was trying to break through. Cole could hear it pounding against the window panes, that endless rhythm of wind and water that made a man feel both alive and forgotten. Inside, the air thickened with warmth and silence. Ilara sat near the hearth, her hands stretched toward the flames, and steam rose from her damp sleeves. She looked small, fragile even, yet there was a kind of quiet strength in the way she held herself, like a woman who'd weathered worse storms than this one. Cole busied himself with chores he didn't need to do, poking at the fire, straightening the tools by the door, just to give his hands something to do besides tremble, But no matter how much noise the storm made outside, he couldn't drown out the sound of her voice when she finally spoke again. "You ever get tired of the silence out here?" she asked. Her tone was soft, but beneath it was something sharp, like the edge of a memory. Cole glanced her way, then shrugged. "Silence don't bother me," he said. "It's the noise in your own head that'll drive you mad." She smiled faintly, tracing her fingers along the rim of her mug. "Maybe that's why I left," she murmured. "Too many voices in mine." He caught the tremor in her words, the kind that didn't come from cold. He wanted to ask who she was running from, but he'd learned long ago that asking a person's past was like opening a wound. It bled whether they wanted it to or not, so he said nothing. Ilara leaned back in the chair, eyes half closed, listening to the fire crackle and the storm rage. "I used to think the sound of thunder was God reminding me I was small," she said. "But tonight it feels like he's chasing me." Cole looked up from the floorboards. "Then he ain't doing a very good job," he said quietly. "You made it here." That drew a ghost of a laugh from her, light but real. For a brief second he saw what she must have looked like before the world broke her. Young, radiant, alive. It stirred something deep in him. Something he'd buried under years of solitude and grit. He found himself watching her longer than he meant to, memorizing the way the light played over her face, the way her lips pressed together as if holding back words too heavy to let loose. When the wind howled again, she flinched and looked toward the window. The storm's fury seemed to mirror whatever raged inside her. Cole followed her gaze and said softly, "Ain't nothing out there but sky and ghosts. You're safe here." But Ilara shook her head. "You can't promise that," she whispered. "Not when the things that haunt you don't live outside." The truth of it cut through him like cold air. He sat down across from her, elbows on his knees. "I know something about ghosts," he said. "I used to see one every time I looked in the mirror." She met his eyes then, truly met them, and for the first time, the air between them felt alive with more than warmth. "Who was she?" she asked softly. He hesitated. "My wife," he said finally. "Wasn't much of a marriage, truth be told. She left after the winter took our son." His voice cracked on the last word and he swallowed it down. "That was a long time ago. After that I just stayed out here. Easier to fight the weather than people." Ilara's expression softened and her eyes shimmered in the firelight. "I'm sorry," she said, and the sincerity in her voice hit harder than pity. "Grief doesn't end. It just learns how to breathe quieter." Cole nodded because she was right. It never went away. It just found a way to live with you, like a shadow that followed even when the light was gone. She looked down, her fingers twisting in the edge of the blanket. "My husband wasn't the man I thought he was," she said.
He had hands that spoke in anger and eyes that never saw me.
"When he died last spring, people called it mercy. I called it freedom." The confession hung heavy between them, raw and real. Cole didn't know what to say, so he did the only thing a man like him could. He listened. The storm moaned against the walls as if the whole night was eavesdropping. Ilara drew a shaky breath. "I thought if I rode far enough I could forget what it felt like to be afraid. But the fear followed me, same as the rain." Cole reached out then, slowly, as if afraid she might vanish. His hand stopped just short of hers, the space between them pulsing with something neither of them dared name. "You ain't afraid now," he said quietly. Her gaze lifted to meet his, and there, in the fire's flickering gold, he saw not fear but a kind of fragile courage. "Maybe not of you," she whispered, "but of what this night means." Cole's throat tightened. "Ain't no meaning to it," he said, though he knew it was a lie. "Just two souls waiting out a storm." She smiled then, sad and knowing. "You don't believe that any more than I do." Thunder cracked again, closer this time, shaking the cabin walls. The lantern flickered, shadows dancing across their faces. Cole stood pacing once, twice, trying to put distance between what he felt and what he feared. "You should get some rest," he said, voice rough. "You can take the bed. I'll sit by the fire." But when he turned, she was standing, closer than before, her eyes deep and searching. "You don't have to keep pretending you're made of stone, Cole," she said. "The world already punished you enough for being human." He froze, every muscle drawn tight. The storm outside screamed through the trees, but the real storm was inside now, quiet, trembling, alive. She reached up, touched his arm lightly, her fingers warm against the fabric of his shirt. It wasn't desire that moved between them, but recognition. Two broken hearts finding the same rhythm. Cole closed his eyes, fighting the instinct to step away. But when he opened them again, she was still there, looking at him as though he was both her shelter and her sin. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel alone. The storm raged deep into the night, relentless as memory. The thunder had moved closer to the mountains, but rain still came in hard waves that blurred the world beyond the cabin walls. Inside, the fire burned low and steady, its glow turning everything into a dream of gold and shadow. Cole sat by the hearth, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the flames as if they might tell him what to do. Ilara sat nearby, wrapped in his old blanket, her hair loose now, drying in soft waves that caught the firelight. The silence between them had changed again. It wasn't the uneasy quiet of strangers anymore, but the fragile calm that comes after truth is spoken. It was the kind of silence you could fall into and never quite climb out of. Ilara watched the rain through the window, her expression somewhere between peace and ache. "I used to love storms," she said quietly. "When I was a girl, I'd sit by the porch and count between lightning and thunder. Thought if I could predict when it would strike, I'd never be afraid of it." She turned to him, a faint smile ghosting her lips. "Turns out it's not the thunder that scares you. It's the waiting." Cole looked at her then, seeing not just her beauty but the weary grace of a woman who had learned how to endure. "Maybe that's what life is," he said, voice low. "Just waiting between storms, pretending the sun means we're safe." She tilted her head, studying him. "Do you still pretend?" He took a long breath, then shook his head. "Not anymore." For a long time neither spoke. The fire popped softly. The cabin walls creaked as if sighing under the weight of old memories, and outside, the wind howled over the hills. Cole found himself remembering things he'd buried. His boy's laughter echoing through the same cabin, his wife's voice fading into the snow the night she left. He had built walls thick enough to keep every feeling out, but now those walls were cracking, and through the cracks came her voice, her warmth, her scent of rain and courage. Ilara's eyes met his, and it felt like standing on the edge of a canyon, terrifying, beautiful, endless. "You ever wonder," she said softly, "if maybe we don't find people by chance? Maybe the storms just push us where we need to be." Cole thought about that, staring into the fire. "If that's true," he said, "then I guess this storm wanted us both to stop running." She smiled then, but it trembled at the edges. "I'm not sure I know how." "Ain't a thing you learn," he said. "You just stop moving and let the ground hold you." He rose then, slow and uncertain, and crossed to the window. Lightning split the sky wide open, white and furious. He turned back to her, the light flashing across his face like judgment. "Storm's dying," he said, though he didn't sound sure. Ilara stood too, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. She walked toward him, bare feet silent against the wooden floor. When she stopped, she was close enough for him to see every freckle across her cheek, every shadow beneath her eyes. "You're lying," she whispered. "The storm's still out there. You just don't want me to see it." Cole's chest tightened. "Maybe I don't," he admitted. "Maybe I don't want you seeing the things I can't fight anymore." Her eyes softened. "You think I haven't seen worse?" He wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe she was as strong as she looked, but the truth was, strength always came with scars. He reached for her hand then, not meaning to. But it happened the way rain falls, inevitable, uncontrollable. Her fingers slid into his like they'd been waiting all their lives for that single act. The touch wasn't bold or desperate. It was quiet, honest. A shared recognition of everything that had broken them and everything that still kept them breathing. "You're warm," she murmured, almost surprised. "So are you," he said. "Guess neither of us is dead yet." She laughed, a soft, weary sound that made the whole cabin seem lighter. They stood like that for a long time, hand in hand, listening to the rhythm of the rain. The fire flickered low, throwing long shadows across the walls, and somewhere in that moment the storm outside became an echo of the one inside. Cole's heart beat heavy in his chest, slow and certain, and Ilara's breath came unevenly as though she were fighting tears she didn't understand. "Cole," she whispered, "what happens when the sun comes up?" He looked at her, his jaw tightening with the kind of truth that hurts to speak. "You'll ride back," he said, "and I'll go back to pretending this cabin ain't empty." Her eyes filled with something too deep for words. "Is that what you want?" He couldn't answer. He just looked at her, really looked, and for the first time saw not just a lost woman but a mirror of himself. "Wanting don't change what the world gives you," he said quietly. "It never did." She stepped closer, so near now he could feel her breath. Maybe the world doesn't get to decide this time. Cole's hand lifted, hesitated, then brushed a strand of damp hair from her cheek. "Careful," he murmured. "You talk like a woman who's ready to start something she can't finish." Her lips curved into a faint, brave smile. "Maybe I already did." A long silence followed, broken only by the steady heartbeat of the rain. Then she leaned forward, resting her forehead lightly against his chest. He froze, not from fear, but from the unbearable tenderness of it. He could feel her trembling, not from cold, but from the weight of everything she'd carried. His arms rose slowly, uncertainly, and came to rest around her shoulders. It was not a lover's embrace, but a surrender. Two weary souls finding peace in the only way they knew how, by holding on. Outside, the thunder rolled away into the distance, leaving behind a hush so deep it felt like the world had exhaled. Inside, the fire dimmed to embers, and Cole knew, without speaking, that something had shifted forever. Whether the morning would bring regret or grace, he didn't know. But for that one small stretch of night, he let himself believe in warmth again. The gray hours before sunrise are the cruelest. They belong to no one, not night, not morning, and every shadow feels like a question that can't be answered. Inside Cole's cabin, the fire had burned down to a dull orange glow, the air thick with the scent of smoke, rain, and something that felt like forgiveness. Ilara stirred first. She hadn't slept so much as drifted, half awake, half somewhere else, her head resting near his shoulder, her heart still racing to the rhythm of the rain that had finally begun to ease. She sat up slowly, pulling the blanket closer around her, and looked toward the window where the world was turning from black to blue. The storm had passed. But storms never really leave. They just move far enough away that you can pretend you don't still hear them. Cole was already awake. He'd been watching the coals fade, counting the seconds between each sigh of the wind. When Ilara moved, he didn't speak at first. He only turned his head, meeting her gaze in the soft half-light. There was no surprise there, no shame, only a quiet understanding of what the night had taken and what it had given back. "You should get ready to ride," he said, voice rough from disuse. "The river'll rise once the sun warms it." She didn't answer. Her fingers traced the edge of the blanket, slow and thoughtful. "It's strange," she murmured, "how something can feel like an ending before it's even over." Cole rubbed a hand over his jaw, feeling the ache that came from holding back too much. "Out here," he said, "nothing ends. It just changes shape." He rose and crossed to the window. The rain had left the world shining. Muddy ruts turned to mirrors, the grass silver with dew. In the distance, a thin line of sunlight split the horizon. He hated how beautiful it looked. Beauty, he'd learned, was just another kind of pain. Ilara stood behind him, close enough that he could sense her warmth. "If I leave," she asked softly, "does this stay here? Or does it follow me?" He closed his eyes. "Both," he said. "It'll follow you till you find something louder. Then it'll come back when it's quiet." She smiled sadly. "That sounds like you know from experience." "Maybe I do." He turned to face her, and the morning light caught in her eyes, turning them a color he'd never seen before. Something between amber and sorrow. "You were the first person I talked to in years," he said. "Properly talked to?" Ilara looked down. "Then I suppose I did something right, even if I'm about to undo it." The way she said it, steady, gentle, made his chest tighten. He wanted to ask her to stay, to let the storm be their beginning instead of their shelter. But he couldn't. He knew better than to hold on to something that didn't belong to the land. The sound of her footsteps as she moved about the room was quiet but final. She found her hat where it had dried by the hearth, brushed dust from her coat, and tightened the strap of her satchel. Every movement was deliberate, like a prayer said too often to still carry hope. Cole busied himself with his coffee, though it had long gone cold. "Road'll be soft," he muttered. "Watch the crossing by the ridge, it floods easy." She nodded, then came to stand near the table. "You always give directions like you're sending someone away for good?" she asked. He managed a crooked smile. "It's the only kind I know." For a long time, neither of them moved. The silence between them had weight now. Thick, honest, the kind that only comes when there's nothing left to hide. Finally, Ilara stepped closer. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small silver locket, tarnished and plain. "I don't have much," she said, pressing it into his hand. "But this is from before the noise started." It might remind you that quiet can be kind too. He wanted to refuse, to tell her he didn't need anything to remember her by, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he closed his fingers around the locket, feeling its warmth. "I ain't good with keepsakes," he said. "They make the ghosts louder." "Then maybe let this one talk softer," she whispered. Outside, the first light of dawn broke across the wet land, turning the plains into rivers of gold. Elara stood by the door, hand on the latch. "Cole," she said without turning, "last night, you gave me something I didn't think I'd find again." "What's that?" "Stillness." He swallowed hard. "You gave me the same." She opened the door then, and the morning air rushed in, fresh, damp, full of birdsong and endings. She hesitated once more, glancing back. "If you ever get tired of the silence," she said, "there's a town 2 days east. The one with the church bell that never rings. Maybe I'll be there." He watched her step out into the dawn, her figure swallowed by mist and light. The sound of her horse's hooves faded into the wet earth, steady and sure. Cole stood in the doorway long after she disappeared, the locket heavy in his palm. Around him the world began to wake. The drip of rain from the eaves, the creak of the porch, the distant cry of a hawk cutting through the sky. It should have felt like any other morning, but it didn't. Something in him had shifted, subtle as a breath, irreversible as sunrise. When he finally stepped outside, the mud sucked at his boots and the air smelled of rain and memory. He slipped the locket into his pocket and looked toward the line of hills where she'd gone. The clouds were breaking apart now, streaks of light spilling through the gaps. Maybe she'd make it to that town. Maybe she wouldn't. Maybe he'd find his way there someday, or maybe he'd just keep listening to the ghosts until they stopped sounding like her voice. Either way, the world had changed its tune, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like hiding from it. Weeks passed and the plains healed fast. The flooded creeks sank back into their beds. The grass straightened under the sun, and the same hawks circled over the same ridges as if nothing had changed. Only the cabin knew better. The smell of smoke lingered longer in its timbers. The chair by the fire stayed turned slightly toward the other, as though still waiting for someone to fill the space between them. Cole worked the land as he always had, mending fence, breaking horses, trading at the feed store when he had to. But everything he touched carried a faint echo of that storm. The wind no longer sounded empty. It carried a note of her laughter he couldn't quite forget. He caught himself talking out loud sometimes, half expecting her to answer, and when the words died in the air, he'd smile in spite of the ache it left. At night he would sit outside with his coffee and the silver locket resting in his palm. He never opened it. Whatever picture or memory hid inside belonged to her past, and he didn't need to steal it to feel close to her. It was enough to know that she had trusted him with something small and real. Some nights the sky burned clear and cruel, stars sharp as needles. Other nights the clouds rolled in from the west, low and dark, promising rain. When thunder grumbled far off, Cole would glance toward the hills and imagine her somewhere under the same sky, maybe looking east and thinking of the man who had once locked the door on a storm. That thought steadied him better than prayer. Autumn crept in quiet. The cottonwoods turned the color of old brass. The mornings came colder, and the river by the ridge froze thin along its edges. Travelers who passed through town sometimes spoke of a woman working at the inn 2 days east, a kind soul with eyes like dusk and hands that smelled of saddle soap. Cole listened, nodded, and asked no questions. He knew enough of roads and hearts to understand that some distances are meant to stay unmeasured. Instead, he fixed the porch, patched the roof, and taught himself how to play the battered harmonica his boy had once loved. The music was rough, uncertain, but when he hit the right notes, it sounded a little like rain on the window pane. One evening, near the end of the first frost, a rider came down the trail. The figure slowed at the gate, left something hanging on the post, and turned back toward the hills without a word. When Cole reached it, he found a small bundle wrapped in cloth, a new coffee tin, and a sprig of wild sage tied with ribbon. No letter, no name, just the quiet scent of places he'd never seen. He stood there a long time, wind lifting the brim of his hat, before carrying it inside. He set the sage above the hearth and the coffee on the shelf beside the pot. The cabin felt warmer that night, though the fire burned no higher than usual. Years later, when storms rolled across the range again, neighbors sometimes said they saw a light in Cole Maddox's window long after midnight, and a shape sitting by the fire, calm as if listening to an old friend's story. They wondered why a man who lived alone smiled at thunder the way other folks smiled at sunshine. Only the prairie knew that somewhere out beyond the ridge the wind was carrying a whisper that belonged to him. And though the world had moved on, though seasons had washed his footprints from the dirt, the silence he'd once feared had turned gentle, no longer hollow, no longer cruel. It was the sound of peace earned the hard way. It was the sound of two storms finally resting,